So today's episode is a deck tech on a super salty commander. When it comes to salty cards in Commander, well, generally they're just basically cards that rub a player the wrong way. Maybe the card is overpowered, maybe it shuts players down, or maybe it's just, well, kind of annoying. Regardless, the salty commander that I'm talking about on this episode is Vorinclex, Voice of Hunger. And my goodness, is this a salty card? I mean, this one is pretty much agreed upon in Commander to be a very salty card according to EDH Rec and their salt score. It has a salt score of 2.75, which is the fourth highest of any card in Commander. And that salt score is based on nearly 3.5 million votes. So yeah, it's going to be hard to argue against this being a salty commander when you take it to the table. So if you end up getting this deck, just make sure you're aware of that. And with that, be aware that you're probably going to be considered enemy number one from the get-go, and you're going to be targeted right away. Vorinclex is a very salty commander because, well, it is a 7/6 Praetor with trample that costs 6 green, and it says, whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced. And on the other end of things, whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, that land doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So, like the other Praetors, Vorinclex has a massive upside for you and a massive downside for your opponents, and this downside is incredibly brutal and definitely the driving force behind that massive salt score. Your resources are essentially doubled, and your opponents are essentially halved in that they don't get to untap their lands when they utilize them for mana. Or at least I should say it's a delayed untap, but yeah, you essentially blank someone's turn if they tap out. Because on their next turn, they're not going to have access to any of their lands to utilize for anything. And while Vorinclex does cost 8 mana, which is a lot, we can get it out pretty quickly because obviously we are in green and we've got access to the best ramp out there. And of course, the more and more lands that we get in play, the more mana we have access to when our commander is in play, and the less mana that our opponents have access to, essentially. Now, even on a budget, this commander can be incredibly brutal, and while the commander itself isn't all that budget at $15 just on its own, the rest of the deck is very budget friendly at less than $1 per card. And speaking of those cards, well, I'm going to be taking you through them with different tactics that show you how this deck works and how we're going to win with it. And of course, if you are interested in this deck, well, I mean, get ready to, get targeted by all of your opponents because this is a very salty commander. Regardless, there is a link in the description to the deck list, so make sure you keep that in mind. But now with all that said, let's jump into it. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble. I love saying that. Anyways, by paying 2 and tapping and sacrificing it, you get a basic land into play tapped. And of course, essentially the exact same thing can be done with Fauna Fertility, which is an enchantment, and Diligent Farmhand, which is a creature that again get you a basic into play tap by paying 1 in green and sacrificing them. Regardless, these are some fantastic turn 1 plays. Speaking of which, there's Search for Tomorrow, another great turn 1 play. It has to spend 2 for a green, and it's going to get us a basic land into play untapped. On turn 2, though, we've got Rampant Growth, which get a basic into play tapped, and Secure Tribe Elder, which we can sacrifice to do the exact same thing. So, sorry Steve, but you're probably not going to stick around too long. Moving on, we've got some other creatures that can help us ramp as well, with Farhaven Elf, Springbloom Druid, and Beanstalk Giant. When Farhaven Elf enters the battlefield, we get a basic land into play tapped, and Springbloom Druid's going to have to sacrifice 1 land to go get 2 basics into play tapped. Beanstalk Giant, though, helps out in a different way. It's got an adventure that is Fertile Footsteps. For 2 and a green, we get a basic land into play untapped, and of course, if we get Beanstalk Giant in play itself, its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands we control. Which, of course, is going to be a ton, so yeah, this can be a pretty heavy hitter for us. And speaking of heavy hitters, well, at least for 3 mana, we've got Topiary Stomper, a 4/4 Vigilance that has, when it enters the battlefield, you get a basic land into play tapped, and it can't attack or block since we got 7 or more lands, which of course we can get to very quickly with this deck. And then finally, we've got Wood Elves and Yavimaya Dryad, each of which are going to get us a Forest into play, and Wood Elves Forest even comes into play untapped. But of course, we're nowhere near done with ramping just yet. Because we also have plenty of cards that are going to help us get 2 lands with cards like Cultivate, Grow from the Ashes, and Explosive Vegetation. Cultivate's going to get us 2 basics, 1 goes into play tapped and 1 goes into our hand. And then Grow from the Ashes can be kicked for 2, and when we do, we're going to get 2 basics into play untapped. Next up, there's Explosive Vegetation, which is a 4-mana sorcery that's going to get us 2 basics into play tapped. And actually, that's not the only card that can do that, because we're also going to be running Circuitous Route, which does the exact same thing, Migration Path that does as well, or we can cycle it for 2 in Vastwood Surge that does the exact same thing, but if we kicked it for 4, we also get 2+1 counters on each creature we control. So this can make our massive army even more massive, and we'll talk about that army here in a bit. But first, let's talk about even more ramp with cards like Terramorph, Hunting Wilds, and Ranger's Path. Terramorph's going to get us 1 basic into play untapped, and it's got Rebound, so we get to do it again. And then Hunting Wild's going to get us 2 forests into play tapped, and if we kicked it, we untap all forests we put into play this way, and they become 3/3 green creatures with haste that are still lands. And then of course Ranger's Path is a very simple card. It's going to get us 2 forest cards into play tapped. And obviously with a mono green deck, that's basically the exact same thing as Explosive Vegetation. But of course we've got ways to get even more lands with cards like Niss's Renewal and Traverse the Outlands. Niss's Renewal says search your life for 3 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, you gain 7 life. And then Traverse the Outlands says search your life for X basic land cards, where X the greatest power among creatures you control, put those cards on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. I mean, let's just say we've got Vorinclex in play, yeah, that's gonna be 7 lands. Which, of course, when we untap with that with Vorinclex in play is basically, 14 mana? Yeah, that's pretty gross for a 5 mana spell. Up next, we've got some different ways to ramp though with Colony Heart Expedition, Druid Class, and Animus Awakening. Colony Heart Expedition has landfall. Whenever a land comes into play, we get a quest counter on it, and by removing 3 quest counters on it, we sacrifice it and get 2 basics into play tapped. And then Druid Class can help us out in a lot of ways. It says whenever a land enters battlefield under control, you gain 1 life. Its level 2 is you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and its level 3 is when this class becomes level 3, target land you control becomes a creature with haste, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. It's still a land. So this can gain us a lot of life, help us play extra lands, and of course, it can help us make a massive creature out of one of our lands. And speaking of massive, well, we can put a massive amount of mana into Animus Awakening. It's an X mana spell that says really top X cards of your library, put all land cards from among them on the battlefield, tap the rest of them from your library in a random order. And if we've got Spell Mastery by having 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in our graveyard, we untap those lands. So with this, and with our commander doubling up our mana, we can essentially end up generating even more mana if we are able to untap those lands. But now that we've talked about starting up our plan and ramping, what are some ways that we can throw a wrench into our opponent's plans? You know, on top of our commander just doing so just by being in play. First up, we've got some great removal spells like Return to Nature, which can destroy an artifact or an enchantment, or exile a card from a graveyard. And then Beastly Link can destroy any permanent, and its controller is going to create a 3/3 green beast creature token. And in Commander, a 3/3 is of course no big deal, especially for this deck. And speaking of which, we also have some creatures that can help us out. Reclamation Sage says when it enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then Acidic Slime can do the exact same thing, or destroy a land, and on top of that, it's a 2/2 with Death Touch. So this can also be a fantastic blocker for us in a lot of scenarios. And speaking of fantastic creatures, we're also going to be running Steelbane Hydra, Kogla the Titan Ape, and Woodfall Primus. Steelbane Hydra is a fantastic mana dump for us. It's going to enter the battlefield with X counters on it, and by paying 2 and a green, you can remove a counter from it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then Kogla is a 7/6, and when it enters the battlefield, it's going to fight up to 1 target creature we don't control, and on top of that, when it attacks, we destroy target artifact or enchantment that defending player controls. Next up, there's Woodfall Primus, a 6/6 with Trample that has, when it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-creature permanent, and it's got Persist, so when it dies, it comes right back with a -1/-1 counter on it, so we get that ETB again. Yeah, these can take out quite a few things for us. Speaking of which, we've got Thorn Mammoth, a 6/6 with Trample that has, whenever it and other creature enters the battlefield under our control, it's going to fight up to 1 target creature we don't control. And yet another elephant in this deck is Terastodon, a 9/9, and when it enters the battlefield, destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents. For each permanent put into a graveyard this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token, which works very well with something like Azuri's Predation, which says for each creature your opponents control, create a 4/4 green beast creature token. Each of those beasts fights a different one of those creatures. So this can make us a massive army that is going to fight and take out a lot of our opponent's creatures. But now that we've talked about taking out our opponent's things, how can we protect our own? First up, we're going to be running Swiftfoot Boots, which gives our commander hexproof and haste. And then we've got Dawnglade Regent, which is an 8/8 that has, when it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch, and as long as you're the Monarch, permanents you control have hexproof. With this kind of attack and all the big threats that we have, it's going to be very easy for us to hold on to the Monarch, or at the very least, very easy for us to get it back. And speaking of hexproof, we've got Archetype of Endurance, which is a 6/5 that's going to give creatures we control hexproof, and it says creatures your opponents control lose hexproof and can't have or gain hexproof. So while our things are going to be protected, our opponents' things will not be. Finally, we're also going to be running Sandworm Convergence, which is an enchantment that says creatures with flying can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, and at the beginning of your end step, create a 5/5 green worm creature token. So not only can this protect us from flyers, but it can also create a massive army. But how are we actually going to get to all these awesome cards? Well, we've got plenty of fantastic card advantage spells in this deck, like Harmonize, Hunter's Insight, and Shamanic Revelation. Harmonize will draw us 3 cards for 4 mana. Hunter's Insight is an instant that says choose target creature you control. When that creature deals combat to a player or planeswalker this turn, draw that many cards. And then Shamanic Revelation says draw a card for each creature you control. You gain 4 life for each creature you control at power 4 or greater. A lot of creatures in this deck are quite massive, so they're going to meet that requirement, so this can draw us a ton of cards and gain us a lot of life in the process. Next up, we've got Return of the Wild Speaker, which is a very flexible card in this deck. It says choose 1, draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. Again, we've got a lot of massive creatures in this deck, so this can draw us a ton of cards, or it can pump our entire army. And speaking of drawing a lot of cards, there's Soul's Majesty, which is going to draw us cards equal to the power of target creature we control. So although it isn't flexible like Return of the Wild Speaker, it still is very effective at drawing us a lot of cards. Speaking of which, there's Life's Legacy, which makes us sacrifice 1 creature to draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. So for just 2 mana, we can draw a lot with this. In a very similar way, there's Momentous Fall, which is going to make us sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to its power and gain life equal to its toughness. And with this one being at instant speed, we can do this if a creature is going to get taken out anyways. And finally, we've also got some other ways to draw with Garruk's Uprising, Soul the Harvest, and Sandstone Oracle. Garruk's Uprising says when it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. On top of that, creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. And then Soul the Harvest is quite similar to that last part. It has whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. But we can also draw a lot of cards at once with Sandstone Oracle, which says when it enters the battlefield, choose an opponent. If that player has more cards in hand than you, draw cards equal to the difference. With this deck, we are able to just basically dump our hand onto the board once we get set up properly, and yeah, this can draw us a lot of cards because our opponents are probably going to be stuck having a decent amount of cards in their hand that they can't cast because they can't tap their lands efficiently when our commander's in play. But speaking of tapping lands efficiently for mana, well, what are some things that we can dump a lot of mana into thanks to our commander to finish out the game? First up, how about Genesis Hydra, an X mana plant Hydra that says whenever you cast a spell, reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put a non-land permanent card with mana value X or less among them onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest into your library, and of course, it enters the battlefield with X counters on it. So this can be a massive threat that can also go get us another massive threat. Next up, there's Hooded Hydra, which also enters the battlefield with X counters on it, and when it dies, we get a 1/1 green snake creature token for each counter on it. And then yet another Hydra is Hydra Broodmaster, a 7/7 with XX and a green monstrosity X. On top of that, when it becomes monstrous, we create XXX green Hydra creature tokens. So this can be a huge threat that also creates even more huge threats. In a somewhat similar way, there's a sorcery that basically does this with Gelatinous Genesis. It's going to create XXX green ooze creature tokens. Speaking of which, we can also make a massive number of tokens with Wolfbriar Elemental. It's got multi-kicker green. Whenever it enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token for each time it was kicked. And when it comes to making 2/2s, we can make even more with Zendikar's Royal, which is going to make us a 2/2 green elemental creature token whenever we have a land enter the battlefield under our control, which, as you notice with all the ramp that we have in this deck, is going to happen quite often. So we're also going to be running Rampaging Baloths, which is a 6/6 with trample that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. This can make us a massive army in absolutely no time. Next up, we've got Myojin of Towering Might, an 8/8 that is going to enter the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it if we cast it from our hand, and it says remove an indestructible counter from it, distribute 8/1 counters among any number of target creatures you control to gain trample until end of turn. So this can be a massive creature that is very hard to take out, and then when we need to, we can pump a lot of creatures, or again, just maybe stack all those counters onto Vorinclex to make it into a 2-shot KO. But we can also pump our team with something like Enraged Forerunners, which is a 7/7 with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, and when it enters the battlefield, other creatures we control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. So of course, this can work very well with all of our token producers, again, just pumping all of them and helping us get a lot of damage through. But some creatures that we really want to swing out with are some Eldrazi like Ulamog's Crusher and Artisan of Kozilek. Ulamog's Crusher is an 8/8 with Annihilator 2 that has to attack each combat if able, and yeah, we really want to do that, because again, Annihilator means that whenever this creature attacks, the defending player sacrifices 2 permanents. And then Artisan of Kozilek also has Annihilator 2, and of course on top of that, whenever we cast this spell, we can return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. So this is a massive threat that can bring back another massive threat. Now, as great as all these cards are, there is one in my opinion that stands above the rest, and that is the Golden Pig of this deck. The Golden Pig of this deck is the #1 card out of our 99, and the Golden Pig is God Pharaoh's Statue. God Pharaoh's Statue is a legendary artifact for 6 that says, spells your opponents cast cost 2 more to cast, and at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses 1 life. Again, when our commander is in play, it is already an incredibly brutal effect, making it so that our opponent's lands don't untap on their next untap step if they're using them for mana. So our opponents obviously have to be very, very cautious with how they use mana, and God Pharaoh's Statue just adds another layer to that, making it so much harder. Because now not only do their lands not untap, but also every single spell they cast is going to cost 2 more to cast. So even just say they're trying to cast a 1 mana spell, they're going to have to tap 3 lands for that, and then those lands don't untap during their next untap step, so they just wasted essentially, 6 mana overall over 2 turns on a 1 mana spell? Yeah. Vorinclex is already brutal, and God Pharaoh's Statue helps take that to another level, and that's why it is the Golden Pig of this deck. But now that we've talked about every single non-land card in this deck, let's move on to the lands. So first up, we've got Rogue's Passage, which can help make a creature unblockable by paying 4 and tapping it. And then we've got Mosswork Bridge, which has Hideaway. When it enters the battlefield, we get to exile one of our top 4 cards of our library, and then we get to tap it for a green, or we can pay a green and tap it and play the exile card without paying its mana cost if creatures we control have total power of 10 or greater, which of course with this deck is very easy to meet. Next up, we've got an MDFC land with Colony Ambush, which says target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. So if we need it as a land, great, we can utilize the back of it by putting into play tap, or again, if we need it as a fight spell, we can utilize the front. Next up, we've got 2 lands that can help us ramp us as well, with Mirrored Landscape and Blighted Woodland, each of which can get us 2 forests into play tapped. And of course, the rest of the deck is going to be very simple with a bunch of forests. And now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, let's talk about the price. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, even though Vorinclex itself is pretty expensive, the rest of the deck is very budget friendly, being less than $1 per card, so the estimated cost of this deck is still just $42.70, even with Vorinclex in there. Also, keep in mind that you might be able to save even more if you already have the basics for this deck, because those basic lands are included at 10 cents a piece in that estimated cost. And speaking of savings, you might be able to save even more than that by buying this deck on TCG Player and utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, which of course need a home too. That being said, keep in mind that that estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.